The courtroom was hushed, the weight of the judge's verdict hanging heavily in the air. The defendant, a young black man in his early 20s, stood rigid as the judge read aloud his sentence. The gavel came down, and the words struck like a thunderclap. 20 years without the possibility of parole. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a heavy, suffocating silence. In the front row, the young man's mother clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. The judge, a middle-aged white man with a stern expression, barely glanced at her anguish as he leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of finality. For him, this was another case closed, another name added to the roster of the condemned. But not everyone was silent. Seated at the defense table, the young man's lawyer, a poised and sharp black woman named Maya Williams, locked eyes with the judge. Her face was calm, but her eyes blazed with determination. She stood slowly, her voice firm but respectful. "Your Honor," she began, "before we adjourn, I would like the court to consider a few matters that seem to have been overlooked." The judge raised an eyebrow but waved her on, clearly skeptical. Maya had faced moments like this countless times before, where her voice was dismissed before she even spoke, her words deemed inconsequential. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just defending her client. She was challenging the very foundation of a system that had failed him. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Maya began her counter by presenting the facts that had been overshadowed during the trial. Her voice was steady as she outlined the racial disparities in sentencing, the lack of evidence tying her client to the crime, and the implicit bias that had colored every aspect of the case. "Your Honor, I submit that this is not just a question of guilt or innocence," Maya said, her voice rising with conviction. "This is a question of fairness, of whether justice is truly being served in this courtroom today." The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Ms. Williams, you are dangerously close to challenging the integrity of this court. I am challenging the integrity of a system that disproportionately punishes people who look like my client." Maya shot back, her tone unyielding. "And I am prepared to prove it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge pounded his gavel for silence. But it was too late. The spark had been lit, and everyone in the room could feel the shift. Maya's words weren't just a defense. They were a call to action, a demand for accountability. And as she stood there, unflinching, it became clear that this moment was about more than one man's fate. It was about the soul of the justice system itself. As Maya's words hung in the air, the tension in the room grew palpable. The judge, visibly irritated, leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of annoyance and mild disbelief. He had seen defense lawyers argue passionately before, but there was something different about this moment, about her. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. "The sentence handed down today, Your Honor, is not an isolated case. It is part of a pattern, one that disproportionately affects defendants of color. I am prepared to present evidence that will demonstrate just how deeply these disparities run." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as Maya pulled out a series of documents, placing them deliberately on the defense table. She spoke with precision, her words cutting through the noise. According to the Sentencing Project, Black defendants are on average sentenced to 20% longer prison terms than their white counterparts for the same crimes. This is not speculation, it's a documented fact. The judge's lips thinned into a line, but he said nothing. Maya pressed on. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Jamal Carter, has no prior convictions. Yet the prosecution has painted him as a career criminal based on circumstantial evidence. The lack of concrete proof has been overshadowed by bias, implicit or otherwise." The prosecutor, a well-dressed man in his late 40s, stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory statements with no bearing on this case." Maya turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "Inflammatory, Mr. Davenport? Or inconvenient? The facts don't lie, even if they make us uncomfortable." The judge raised his hand to quiet them both. "Ms. Williams, get to the point. What exactly are you trying to prove here?" Maya took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm trying to prove, Your Honor, that Jamal Carter is not just being sentenced today for a crime he didn't commit, but for the color of his skin. I am trying to prove that the system has failed him, not because it is broken, but because it was designed this way. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even those who had come expecting a routine sentencing were now captivated by Maya's argument. She proceeded to dissect the case against Jamal, pointing out inconsistencies in witness testimonies and highlighting the lack of physical evidence. She detailed how the prosecution's case relied heavily on racial profiling, using vague descriptions to tie Jamal to the crime. Maya's voice grew heavier with emotion as she recounted the toll the case had taken on Jamal's family. His mother has worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, all while attending every court date to support her son. She raised him to believe in this system, to trust that justice would prevail. And yet, here we are, sentencing a young man to 20 years based on assumptions rather than proof. She paused, letting her words sink in. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his stern facade showing cracks. Maya had anticipated this resistance. After all, she wasn't just challenging one man's judgment, but the biases that permeated the very institution he represented. Maya wasn't done. She turned to the jury box, even though they were no longer deliberating. I want you all to think about this. If Jamal Carter didn't look the way he does, if he were a different color, from a different neighborhood, would we even be here today? Would the same evidence have been enough to bring him to trial, let alone convict him? Her question hung in the air, unanswered but undeniable. The judge cleared his throat. Ms. Williams, this is not a forum for social commentary. We are here to discuss the specifics of this case. With all due respect, Your Honor, Maya replied, this case cannot be separated from the society in which it exists. Justice does not happen in a vacuum. Her words were like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples throughout the courtroom. Maya could see the faces of those in the gallery, some nodding in agreement, others stiff with discomfort. The prosecutor, visibly flustered, leaned over to whisper to his assistant. Maya knew she had taken a risk by framing the issue so broadly, but it was a risk worth taking. The harsh sentence wasn't just about Jamal. It was a symptom of a system that had long failed people like him. She looked back at Jamal, who sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The judge, visibly perturbed, called for a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, Maya sat at the defense table, meticulously organizing her notes. Jamal leaned over, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked, his eyes filled with doubt. Maya paused and looked at him, her gaze steady. "I don't know if it will change his mind, Jamal. But I do know this. If we don't speak up now, nothing will ever change." When court reconvened, Maya resumed her argument. But this time she was armed with even more ammunition. She presented a detailed breakdown of similar cases, showing a clear pattern of racial disparity in sentencing. She cited statistics, academic studies, and legal precedents, weaving them into a narrative that exposed the systemic flaws in the justice system. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, in a study conducted by the National Registry of Exonerations, it was found that black defendants are 7 times more likely than white defendants to be wrongfully convicted of serious crimes. This is not an isolated issue. It is a systemic failure. And today, this court has the opportunity to do something about it. The prosecutor stood again, his frustration evident. "Your Honor, this has gone far enough. Counsel is turning this courtroom into a lecture hall. The facts of this case are clear." Maya cut him off, her voice rising with controlled intensity. "The facts are clear, Mr. Davenport, but not in the way you think. The facts show that my client is being punished not for what he did, but for what he represents in the eyes of this system." The judge pounded his gavel. "Ms. Williams, I will not tolerate this courtroom being turned into a platform for your personal agenda." Maya took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. "It's not my agenda, Your Honor. It's justice's agenda." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, even the judge seemed at a loss for how to respond. Maya then pivoted to a critical piece of evidence that had been overlooked during the trial, a surveillance video from the night of the alleged crime. The footage, though grainy, clearly showed a figure that did not match Jamal's description. Despite this, The prosecution had dismissed it as inconclusive. "Your Honor," Maya said, pointing to the screen where the video was being played, "this is what reasonable doubt looks like." And yet, my client was convicted. Why? Because it was easier to see him as guilty than to see him as a human being deserving of fairness. The gallery erupted into murmurs again, and the judge called for order. But Maya could feel the momentum shifting. She had laid bare the cracks in the prosecution's case, and the courtroom was beginning to see them too. As the hours stretched on, Maya called an expert witness, a criminologist who testified about the role of implicit bias in law enforcement and judicial decisions. The witness explained how subconscious stereotypes could influence everything from police investigations to jury deliberations. By the time Maya finished questioning the witness, the mood in the courtroom had changed. The judge, who had initially dismissed her arguments as grandstanding, now appeared contemplative. The prosecutor, once smug and confident, was now frantically scribbling notes, his arguments unraveling with each passing minute. But the most striking transformation was in the gallery. People who had come expecting a routine sentencing now leaned forward in their seats, their expressions a mixture of outrage and determination. Maya's words had not only challenged the judge, but had also ignited something in the audience, a realization that this case was about more than one man. As the day came to a close, Maya delivered her final remarks. "Your Honor, we often speak of justice as blind, impartial, and fair. But today, I ask this court to open its eyes, to see the human being sitting before you, to see the flaws in the system that brought him here, and to see the opportunity we have to set a new precedent. Justice is not a static concept. It is something we must constantly strive toward, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it forces us to confront our own biases." The judge announced that he would need time to deliberate before issuing a final ruling. As the courtroom emptied, Maya felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. 2 days later, the courtroom was packed once again. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a mix of anticipation and unease. Maya sat beside Jamal, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her demeanor calm but her mind racing. This moment was more than just a ruling. It was a chance to challenge the foundations of a system that had failed so many before him. The judge entered the room, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. He cleared his throat, glancing at the written statement in front of him. "This has been one of the more challenging cases I have presided over," he began, his voice measured. "The defense has raised compelling arguments about systemic inequities that cannot be ignored. While my role is not to legislate change, it is to ensure fairness and justice within the confines of the law." The room was silent as the judge turned his attention to Jamal. "Mr. Carter, the evidence presented against you during the trial was insufficient to eliminate reasonable doubt. Additionally, the court must acknowledge that factors beyond the merits of this case may have influenced the proceedings. In light of this, I am overturning your conviction and vacating your sentence." The gallery erupted into gasps and whispers. Jamal's mother let out a cry of relief, covering her face with her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. Jamal sat frozen, his mind struggling to process the words he had just heard. The judge raised his hand for silence, his expression stern but softer than before. "This case has highlighted systemic issues that extend beyond this courtroom. It is not my place to address them here, but I encourage all parties involved, law enforcement, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the community at large, to reflect on the implications of this case." Maya closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaling deeply. She turned to Jamal, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're free," she whispered. "You're finally free." As the court adjourned, the gallery erupted into applause, cheers, and tears. Maya and Jamal were immediately surrounded by supporters, reporters, and family members. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment as Maya spoke to the press outside the courthouse. "This is not just a victory for Jamal Carter," she said, her voice firm but emotional. "This is a victory for justice, for everyone who has ever been silenced, marginalized, or wrongfully condemned by a system that is supposed to protect them. But let me be clear, this is just the beginning. Real change requires more than one overturned conviction. It requires accountability, reform, and a commitment to equity at every level of the justice system. Jamal stood beside her, his voice shaking as he addressed the crowd. I spent months in a cell, wondering if anyone would ever believe me, if anyone would see me as more than just a stereotype. Today, I know that someone did, and for the first time in a long time, I have hope, not just for me, but for others like me. Over the following weeks, the ripple effects of the case were felt far and wide. News outlets covered the story extensively, sparking a national conversation about racial bias in the justice system. Activists and community leaders used Jamal's case as a rallying cry for reform, organizing protests, town hall meetings, and legislative campaigns. Maya became a prominent voice in the movement, using her platform to advocate for policy changes, including mandatory bias training for judges and prosecutors, reforms to sentencing guidelines, and greater oversight of law enforcement practices. The transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. Maya faced backlash from those who resisted change, but she remained undeterred. Each step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward a more equitable system. For Jamal, the journey didn't end with his freedom. He became an advocate for others who had been wrongfully convicted, sharing his story at schools, community centers, and legal conferences. His voice, once silenced, now resonated with a power that inspired others to fight for justice. Together, Maya and Jamal embodied the shift they had fought so hard to create. They proved that change was possible, not because the system allowed it, but because they demanded it. Months after Jamal's release, the echoes of his case continued to reverberate across the nation. What had started as a courtroom battle had grown into a movement, a demand for accountability and reform that could no longer be ignored. For Maya, life had taken on a new rhythm. She had always been driven, but now her work felt imbued with a greater purpose. Every new case she took on, every speech she gave, was a chance to chip away at the system's injustices. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Sitting in her office one evening, surrounded by stacks of case files, Maya reflected on how far they had come. The letters and emails she received daily from people inspired by Jamal's story reminded her that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Jamal, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose. With the help of community organizations and supporters, he founded a nonprofit dedicated to helping others who had been wrongfully convicted. The organization provided legal aid, emotional support, and resources for reintegration into society. Speaking at the launch event for his nonprofit, Jamal addressed a room full of supporters. "I lost a part of my life that I'll never get back, but I'm standing here today because people believed in me, because they refused to let my story end in a prison cell. Now, it's my turn to do the same for others." His words were met with thunderous applause, but for Jamal, the real reward came in the quiet moments. The letters from families thanking him for giving them hope, the smiles of exonerated individuals who had been given a second chance. The case also led to tangible reforms. Advocacy groups successfully lobbied for the introduction of legislation aimed at reducing sentencing disparities and increasing oversight of the justice system. Some states began implementing policies requiring prosecutors to disclose all evidence, ensuring that cases like Jamal's would be less likely to slip through the cracks. Maya and Jamal's story became a symbol of resilience and change, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. But they were careful never to portray their journey as a perfect victory. In a candid interview with a journalist, Maya said, "This isn't a fairy tale ending. There's still so much work to do. But what we've shown is that no matter how broken a system is, people have the power to demand better. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's worth it." As time passed, Jamal and Maya's lives evolved in different ways. Maya continued her work as a defense attorney but also began teaching, mentoring the next generation of lawyers to think critically about their role in the justice system. Jamal became a father, his home filled with the laughter and love he had feared he might never experience. Their paths crossed often, usually at events or fundraisers for the causes they championed. Each time, they would exchange a knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared and the bond that would always connect them. Years later, as Maya stood in front of a packed auditorium delivering a keynote speech, She looked out at the faces in the crowd and thought about the countless stories that had yet to be told, the battles that had yet to be fought. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is just the beginning. Justice is not a destination. It's a journey. And it's a journey we must all take together." Her words were met with a standing ovation, but Maya's mind was already on the next challenge. She knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, but for the first time, she felt hopeful about what lay ahead. Jamal, watching from the audience, nodded in agreement. He had once thought of himself as a victim, but now he saw himself as something more, a testament to the power of perseverance, hope, and the belief that even the most broken systems could be transformed. As the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, one thing was clear. Their story wasn't just about them. It was about everyone who dared to believe that change was possible.